All right, everybody, I wanted to welcome you today. Thank you so much for coming and sharing this hour of time with us. We have a really wonderful program, and I've told I have to stand right here, so that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to read a little bit to you with some opening remarks, but I wanted to welcome you really to our 15th annual celebration of Martin Luther King Day. So we're really gathering today to remember and reflect upon the reason that we have a Martin Luther King Day, aren't we? And I think this is wonderful that we take this time and share together. We've got a great program put together for you today. But annually, we're really here to honor the life work of Dr. King and all of his work to bring equality for all people. So we'll have some poetry, we will have some song, we will have a wonderful guest speaker. Dr. Hogan is with us today. So really, although there has been great strides made in this area of equality, we have a long, long distance yet to go, don't we? And you know, we're reminded of that every day. I think there are things as I think about our own drive here for thinking about inclusion and diversity and the way that we think. You know, I think a lot about breaking down barriers and communicating better. And I think about areas of race and gender and labor rights and poverty and economic class and social justice. There's just a lot of work that we still all have here to do. So I'm really pleased, in fact, last week to have been able to share with you that our emphasis here in the DCRI and the DTMI, we are putting that on engagement, inclusion, diversity. And so I sent a little announcement out about that last week. I think it's really important. It's important. And I'm really delighted that we're going to have that opportunity to work collectively together to make a big dent in that. So I've got the pleasure of opening up this time of ours together, and we will have music, poetry, our keynote speaker, Dr. Hogan. After this program today, out in the atrium, we're going to have light refreshments. There's going to be a book signing. Dr. Hogan will be out there, and I hope that you will take the opportunity to spend a couple of minutes maybe with some people you don't know and get to know them a little bit better. So I think that's one of the great opportunities that we have in front of us today in these next couple of hours. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome my colleague, Michael Sledge, who will introduce our next guest. Thank you, Michael.
Hello. No one told me I had to stand in this spot, but I'll take my cue from Nicole and stand here. So I have the honor and privilege today of introducing our performers, Jessica Hall and Friends of Poetry. So first, Vespertine is a 2012 National Poetry Award nominee, producer, songwriter, spoken word artist, and contributor to the production for Spike Lee's upcoming soundtrack, and I love this, The Sweet Blood of Jesus. So Vespertine, welcome. Gemini is a wordsmith. That was the first word I loved about her bio. Is a wordsmith and metaphoric artist here in Durham. She's traveled the U.S. performing poetry and live paintings referring to mass and pop culture. When she's not painting or speaking poetically, you can find Gemini teaching art and wellness classes. Those are two things I don't take enough of. You can see her beautifully unique pieces of art at piecesofagem.com, so you might want to go check that out. And we'll have some of those on display in the atrium right after this at the reception. And then lastly, our very own Jessica Michelle Hall, who works up in the cord blood bank by day and moonlights as a musician, I guess nights and weekends. Musically talented writer, word architect from Norfolk, Virginia. She's known as Essence when she's frequenting spoken word events. She says you can find her at open mics when she's not playing with her band. So the piece they're going to be performing today is by a little Irish band some of you might have heard of called U2. They're in my top three if I have to go to the desert island. What am I taking with me for music? They would be one of those bands. And I was kind of excited when I saw the piece they were doing, but I got confused because the piece is called MLK, and I immediately mistook it and thought, oh no, that's Pride, but it's not Pride, but it's from the same album, The Unforgettable Fire. It's a great album, a couple of great songs, so they're going to do that piece for you. And Bono, who's the lead singer for U2, had this to say about that piece. He said it was a sort of a lullaby for an idea that was dying in our country, which was Ireland. the idea of nonviolence. So without further ado, welcome to the stage.
Hey, how y'all doing? Good, good. So those of y'all know I'm Vespertine. I'm pretty sure y'all are aware. Um, I do a little bit of spoken word production, yada yada yada, all that good stuff. Um, I'm gonna do a piece for y'all today. How many of y'all are fans of John Coltrane? Okay, okay. Y'all know the history of John Coltrane. Okay. Well, y'all about to learn. Well, this piece in particular was was actually sort of inspired by Martin Luther King. Um, why I wrote this piece, there was a song that John Coltrane and Alice Coltrane, which is his widow, had wrote called "Peace," and it was a dedication to Martin Luther King. So while I was working on my words, I was listening to this. So here we go. Questions for John Coltrane from his saxophone. Dear John, what greater love is there between sweat and brow? What lullabies nest in your breath when you are silent? What am I without your breath? What am I when you are silent? A sword. It's only as powerful as its swordsman. I have no voice without your whispers, my dear John. What other woman know the notes traced into your palms? The Alice fingers coats from you the same songs you loosen from my throat. Who is Naima? And why does the melody in her memorial spill such a longing out of me? Please do not tell me that you love her, but do you not? Dear John, what greater love is there between raw lips and gleaming brass? How Hamlin, North Carolina is our Harlem these days? How hometown are the fingertips that dance along my neck? What bruises did you smudge all down the lengths of me? In the masterpiece of fingerprints from bowl to bell, you claimed every slope, every key. I was yours. Weren't we happy? Before I train trekked all those miles, all those months, wasn't it always just us two? Before the women who loved you mortal, who knew not the blue shades of your breath, knew nothing of the mats of the tips of your fingers, knew nothing of a love. And how was I to know that out of me you would coast the greatest love song titled in the name of another and never mine? And who else would have known that the birthplace of your breath was not your lungs, but the hollowest parts of my belly? When they booed you in France, who stood unflinching at your lips when the heroin swirled radioactive in your blood? Who pours his beams out into sound? And when the cancer thrusts its roots into you and made a fossil of your body, who remained the only vessel of your breath? Dear John, tell me, please, why mothers dread losing their daughters to Jasmine. Tell me why my voice is all this melody when you left. Tell me, how is it that you could have left when we had the greatest love of all? A love of brass and sore lips, a love of exhale, of molding stories through an empty cavity, a love memorial, a love supreme of a music man and his saxophone. Thank you.
How's everyone doing today? Okay, so as he mentioned, I'm a visual artist, I'm a spoken word artist, and I'm also an activist here in Durham. So for anyone who's ever been on 147 and upset because you couldn't get home because we were blocking you, that was me. So with in celebration of MLK, I was really inspired last night. I had the honor of listening to a lecture by Angela Davis, who has been one of my biggest inspirations in what I do here in Durham to bring equality and peace and end police brutality. So when we're remembering Dr. King, we often forget about who stood beside him, who stood behind him. And so this poem is dedicated to those people. This poem is for Coretta. This poem is for Asada, for Angela, for Betty, for countless women who live behind cages created by their own government. This poem, it is for 4 little girls in Birmingham: Cynthia, Denise, Carol, Addie Mae. This poem is for Rosa, for Harriet, for Ruby, for Audrey, for Lorraine, for Nikki, for Shirley, for Michelle, and too many others. See, it is just as violent to forget their names as it is to commit the crimes against them. Let me repeat that. It is just as violent to forget their names as it is to commit crimes against them. Black women, we are often forgotten as being the prime target in this war. For too long, their voices, our voices, have been swept under the feet of those aimed to protect us. Our sacrifice laughed at, looked over, our pain viewed as not important enough to be remembered. Our bodies no longer viewed as sacred temples, but merely as temporary vessels on a mission that they want us to forget. We must realize that the silence of their names is just as deafening as the screams we still hear today. The silence of their names is just as deafening. We must never forget the women. Thank you.
Okay, hopefully you guys can hear me. Can you guys hear me? Can you hear me pretty good in the back? Can you hear the guitar pretty good in the back? No? Yes? No? No? Okay, all right. All right, so this is my take on MLK by U2. And like he said, it's a little known band, but we'll see how I do with it here. Sleep, sleep tonight, and may your dream be realized. If the thunderclouds passes rain, so let it rain, rain down on me. So let it be, so let it be, Martin Luther King. Sleep, sleep tonight, and may your dreams be realized. If the thunderclouds passes rain, so let it rain, rain down on me. So let it be, so let it be, Martin Luther King. So let it be, so let it be, Martin Luther King.
And your friends. I think it's the place in which I'm supposed to stand. We good? All right. So I have the pleasure now of introducing to you our keynote speaker today. And Dr. Wesley Hogan, sitting over here to my left, is the director for the Center of Documentary Studies at Duke University since 2013. She's a historian renowned for her documentary work on the civil rights movement. Founded in 1989 as the first university-affiliated institution in the United States dedicated solely to the legacy and continuing practice of the documentary arts tradition. So that's the Center for Documentary Studies. Dr. Hogan has a PhD and a master's degree in U.S. history from Duke and was previously a professor at Virginia State University, which is a historically black college where she taught since 2003. She was also the co-director of the Institute for the Study of Race Relations at VSU from 2006 through 2009, and their mission is to bring together community organizers, researchers, and young leaders to promote healthy communities. So between 2004 and 2008, Dr. Hogan was active with the projects bringing together the Algebra Project, the Young People's Project, and the Petersburg City Public Schools, and coordinated an oral history project of the civil rights movement in Petersburg. Dr. Hogan's documentary roots are grounded in 20 years of interviewing social activists in both her scholarly and her community work, in particular developing deep relationships with veterans of the Students Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. Her book from this work, Many Minds, One Heart, SNCC's Dream for a New America, won the Lillian Smith Book Award, the Scott Bills Memorial Prize in Peace Studies, and the Library of Virginia Nonfiction Award. Dr. Hogan is currently working on a post-1960s history of young people organizing in the spirit of Ella Baker and co-facilitates a partnership between the SNCC Legacy Project in Duke, One Person, One Vote, the legacy of SNCC, and the fight for voting rights, whose purpose is to bring the grassroots stories and the civil rights movement to a much wider public through web portal, K-12 initiative, and a set of critical oral histories. So our today's keynote address is entitled A Liberated Mind, Ferguson, Staten Island, and Youth Activism in the 21st Century Civil Rights Movement. If you would, please help me welcome Dr. Hogan.
I think I'm good. Is my mic on okay? Can everybody in the back hear me? Wonderful. Well, let me first say I'm so grateful for being here today, and I want to thank Gina Streety and Anthony Dahl and Martin Walston for getting me here and having everything prepared. It's been such an exciting time for me. I've been doing a lot of interviews in the last few weeks out in the Bay Area with young people, and it's really been exciting to think about how to incorporate that into this talk today. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you all here today. I also want to thank so much Vespertine Gemini, and I'm so grateful to Essence too. So I'm going to just give a quick thank you, because one of the few things that I now don't have to do, because you all did it so beautifully, is to call on people into the room and to bring them here with us today. So I hope I do right by how you started us off. Today my job is to share some stories, some useful history perhaps, to shed some new light on what's happening not only today. You know, some people are calling this the third Reconstruction or the new civil rights movements, and they're emphasizing the S. But I'm going to share with you primarily two things, and I think I'm going to shoot for 30 minutes, and then hopefully leave some time for discussion. Because this is work that is evolving and new, I'd really like feedback from people in the audience. I thrive on pushback of any and all kinds, so if you're pushing back because you don't like it, that's helpful to me. And if you're pushing back because something really stuck out to you and resonated for you, that's also helpful. But the two stories I'm going to talk about today is first a forgotten story. So that's the story of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They went by SNCC, so it's not a perfect acronym, right? But it sounds like SNICK. But you'll see it up on the screen as SNCC. And how they help us rethink an old story. So I don't know about you, but most people, when they go K through 12 or even in higher ed, the story they get of civil rights is the following. Rosa Parks sat down, Dr. Martin King stood up, and Lyndon Johnson swooped in and saved the day with the 64 Civil Rights Act and the 65 Voting Rights Act. So I can't lie, I cribbed that from Julian Bond, the former head of the NAACP. But it's a very important and good truism. So most of us, and I know my kids when they went through the K-12 system, that's about it that they got in terms of civil rights. I'm going to try to give some of that forgotten history a fresh look today. And then the second thing that hopefully will lay the groundwork, for, is taking a clear-eyed look at this new story that all of us are watching unfold and some of us are participating in, which is the Black Lives Matter movement. People are calling it many different things. I'm going to refer to it today. The activism that we've seen really since last spring and possibly since 2005, depending on how you cut it, is this Black Lives Matter movement and youth activism today. So everybody knows this story, or a lot of us know this story, right? This is the Birmingham Dogs in '63, and we know this story, which is Dr. King right after, I love this look on his face, right? He's right after he gave the I Have a Dream speech in August of 1963. It would be hard to exaggerate to you today how strange it is that most Americans know about Bull Connor, the guy responsible for this, and they know about Dr. King. Not everything, right? Really pretty much narrowed down into the I Have a Dream speech, but we know about them. And yet, we don't really know about SNCC. In fact, I got to Duke and somebody said you should start interviewing SNCC people because you're interested in social activism. And I'd been through college and I had like my little honors degree in history and I said, what's SNCC, right? So most of us don't know. And it's hard to imagine how odd it is that we don't know about SNCC. I hope those in the room that are scientists and medical people will forgive me from budging in on your analogy territory, but it would be as if the entire team that made possible the first moon landing, the Apollo 11 landing, was simply dismissed after the mission landing. That nobody from NASA debriefed them, nobody asked what they had learned, nobody asked their advice for future space trips. Just imagine for a second how peculiar and dangerous to future missions that would be if the hard-won experiential knowledge of these astronauts and their support team had been ignored. Or to use a metaphor from cultural history, it's as if after Africa Bambaataa and Tony Toney and Busy Bee first started rapping in the late 70s, that everyone forgot to include them in the history of hip-hop. Part of the reason SNCC people are ignored or missing is that in polite company, my friends, they were quite impolite. And so in order to do my research on these young people, this is me in 1993 here in Durham, I had to unlearn a lot. In particular, I had to unlearn a certain kind of politesse that the history department was very good at teaching. And these were manners I'd learned not only here, but in high school and college and religious settings and at my own dinner table. But an old SNCC organizer early on once sort of sat me down and he kind of saw that I was starry-eyed and he said, look, I'm not trying to get you or anybody else to like me. I'm a recruiter. I have to convince people when I recruit them into a voluntary movement that I'm not trying to police them. I'm not trying to be nice to them. Instead, I'm trying to win their respect. And the way you do that is you do not lie to them. But when we're mannerly, when we practice good manners, or the art of being polite, there are definitely things we can't do or say. When we're polite, we can't always tell the truth. So when he said that to me, it was like somebody had just pulled off this huge variety of veils that had been in front of my eyes, and it was really helpful to doing research. And so much as I'd like to be polite with you all today, I can't be. I spent many years studying non-polite people who decided the only way to change the fact that they were being disrespected and ignored was to act in new ways that were perceived by others as impolite. So what Gemini described as, I'm sorry, you shouldn't even say I'm sorry, she said, I'm the one who's been holding up the highway when you try to get home. That's what that's about. So they ignored Jim Crow. They learned the merits of candor rather than those of good manners. And I want to share with you I'm going to share two things that I learned from them. So I'm going to take a little bit of time with them, and then I'm going to flip to what's happening today. As I'm watching many of these things resurface today within the Black Lives Matter movement, even though I think there's some important and relevant distinctions I'll also mention. So this is them, when they first make the opening attempt, and many people have seen this photo. This is right up the road in Greensboro. Dr. King, in perhaps a vivid and slightly off metaphor, which was rare for him, called SNCC people the stormtroopers of the movement. And he meant that kindly. He did not mean to invoke Nazis, right? But what he was saying was that these people went in where nobody else could go. They were brave and they were fearless, although they would now claim that they were fearful. But they acted fearless, and they went into the South. They didn't have mortgages. They didn't have adult responsibilities yet, and they opened up new places where people could act. So they blazed this new trail. And so SNCC people were the Buzz Aldrins and the Neil Armstrongs or the Africa Bombadas or the Grandmaster Flashes. They were the people whose experiences, however, have been ignored. And again, I think it's not only bizarre but dangerous that we don't know about them as a culture. So here they are, they're in their teens and their late 20s. It's the early 1960s. And through their own experiences, sometimes they shocked and horrified and electrified the nation, but most of the time through rather ordinary experiences of trying to get people to vote. They tried to figure out how to make America live out its promise, right, the uncashed promise of one person, one vote. And they worked amidst a white supremacist resistance here in Durham and around the South that was brutal, terrifying, and at times seemingly everywhere, including in the federal government. So my first job today is to tell you a little bit about how they worked, what they did. At the end, I'd like to open it up, as I mentioned before. So before I get too far into who they are and what they did, I'm going to ask you to take your own imagination and put one thing down on, everybody should have maybe a Post-it note. I hope there's some pens circulating. Pick one thing. So for those people in the room, you'd like to see different 50 or 60 years from now. We all have a lot of issues that we care about. I'll give just a framework for that for the young people in the room. When your grandchildren are entering college, what do you want the world to look like? Right? One thing that you want different from how it is today can be anonymous. I'm just going to try to use it to spark some conversation once we get towards the end. For instance, if I had to pick one issue right now, I think I'd say it's that every child has access to a quality education. Now, all of us have different issues, so what I want you to do is be as candid and non-polite, since it's an anonymous forum, as you can, and write down the one thing you'd like to see different 50 or 60 years from now and just pass it to the ends of the row that you're in. So you can keep working on that. I'm going to keep rolling. A lot of people want things to be different. I would argue that there are very few of us that are okay with how things are today. But most of us don't know where to start. Right? We simply don't know how to act on our beliefs. In Durham, we're lucky, for instance. There are many organizations training young people to be leaders in the nonprofit sector. As we see all around us at the university, we have young people going in to be leaders in medicine and government and research and engineering and law. Others become entrepreneurs or community organizers. And then, of course, there are the people that choose a revolutionary path, right? And you see people like Che Guevara, the Black Panthers. Regardless of where we try to make a difference, all of us begin with habits. And I think probably the most important thing is to just take a minute and think about those habits. So these are thought habits, daily activity, habitual ways we interact with people. And most of the time, we repeat habits we've seen other people use. As a young person from a very small age, we're trained to listen to parents and teachers and religious leaders. It's usually not till age 11 or 12 that we're even encouraged to think critically or act democratically. So you hear parents say things like, "Don't ask why, just put the dishes away." Or teachers, "Sit at your desk, begin the math problems." Or principals who say everyone must say the Pledge of Allegiance. People who protest the way things are often sent to their rooms, the principal's office, or kicked out of church. And so, as many of you have no doubt found, we pay a lot of lip service to democracy, but we often don't know how to act it out. In our personal lives, in our families, in our religious organizations, in our community organizations, in our workplaces, or in our politics. So we have a lot of hierarchical habits that get in the way of this pursuit of democracy and equality. So here's where the impolite thing comes in. SNCC people wanted to act democratically all the time. So if they saw a beach that was segregated, they would go swim in the ocean and sit on the beach together. If they saw a courthouse that was segregated with white people on one side and black people on the other, they'd purposely sit in the middle in integrated groups, right? They decided to live in the moment democratically. But just because they figured out how to act doesn't mean that there wasn't a price. And it also means that lots of other people didn't want to break those customs and therefore couldn't act with them. But they understood, above all, the most important and hardest thing was to figure out how to move idea into motion. Right? How do we move idea into motion? And so they did it by trial and error. They acted, and the things didn't work. They tried again. They figured out what wasn't working. They knew that they would mess up. They were okay with that in a way a lot of us as adults are not. You didn't quit. You tried again. So I'm going to give you a story of them. Again, we talked about Rosa Parks. Many people have heard about the integration of Little Rock High School in '57. But I'm going to start the story here. The sit-ins are flashing across the South in February of 1960. Right? We see this happening in Greensboro, and then by the end of 2 months, you have 60,000 young people sitting in across the South. So in the urban South, by the end of the spring semester, they've integrated lunch counters in the urban South. That's really quick. But then there's this lull, and nobody can figure out what to do next. And so the following spring, you have the Freedom Ride, and this is where young people and some adults go in integrated settings, integrated groups, from Washington, D.C., and they're trying to get all the way on a Greyhound bus to New Orleans. So they're going in at each stop into the restrooms and eating eateries of the bus station, and they're trying to use the facilities in integrated groups. The first time they do this, they get a little bit outside of Anniston, Alabama, and they're firebombed. So this is the first image of that. You can see the young people on the side of the road there. They tried to hold the doors closed with them inside, and then they came out. By the barest of margins, no one died that day, but the idea of the Freedom Ride seemed as shattered as this bus, right? This is the bus that's currently shown at the National Civil Rights Museum. So everybody said, including James Farmer, the head of court, it's too dangerous, we can't do it, we've got to stop. And the incident at that point led to one of the Freedom Riders, a young man named John Lewis, immediately turning to his fellow activist Diane Nash, and he says, I don't think we should stop it. I'm a little nervous, I'm not sure what to do. And she says, we're not stopping. The future of the movement, quote, would be cut short if the Freedom Rides are stopped by violence. So they agree the integrated journey had to continue, even if it meant a longer trek into chaos. So what they do is they recruit 19 more young people to join them. This is the second Freedom Ride of 1961. Every one of them are students from Nashville. And they're warned by, and this is important, they're warned by Fred Shuttlesworth, who's one of the most fearless people in the movement, who's survived at least 15 bombings of his house or church up to this point. And he says, don't come. You might be killed. And Nash, who I think, by the way, if you have seen Selma, she is there on screen, but she doesn't say much. And it's a crime because she's a brilliant strategist. So she says, at this moment, she says, if they stop us with violence, the movement is dead. The students have decided, Reverend Shuttlesworth, we're coming. We just want to know, can you meet us at the bus stop? So we're starting with these students. But I'm going to ask you to roll back. Before they get to that key moment where they put their bodies on the line, I'm going to take you back to 1959, not 1961. First Baptist Church in Nashville, in the annex, red brick annex, downtown. And here they're trained by this man, a quiet, methodical, poised young minister who's just come back from 3 years in India where he studied Gandhi's techniques. Lawson was a marvel, and I think he's also a forgotten person. He was who Dr. King called, well, Dr. King thought this of him. Every time Lawson ran a workshop at Dr. King's organization, the SCLC, King made a point of coming and sitting right in the front. So King knew that he possessed unmatched rhetorical skill and used it to represent and interpret the meaning of the movement to many people inside and outside of the movement, particularly to the American public, and he built on the mainstream history of the country in which he himself believed. He understood that these strengths, though widely celebrated, were not in organizing. And so in Lawson, he saw superior mastery of this crucial democratic skill of training people to move from idea to action. And again, we're going to see this in Ferguson because between August and December of 2014, people really had to figure out how do we pass on what we've learned, right? We can't just do something and then let it go. How are we going to figure out how to carry this forward? Who's going to be our Lawson or Lawsons going forward? And he trained them by example. So I'm just going to tell you one quick story about him that boom, puts it right out there. He traveled on the Nashville buses with these young people. And one day he gets on, he refuses to, you put your money in the front, and then you have to get off, and you have to go to the back and get on the back of the bus. And he got on the front, and he refused to get off and get back on the back, so he got on the front. A young white guy decides he's not having any of that, and when Lawson and he get off the bus, this young man spits right in Lawson's face. And so Lawson, without batting an eye, asked the guy for a handkerchief. The guy is so baffled, he pulls out from his back pocket a handkerchief and gives it to Lawson. And so Lawson casually wipes off the spit and hands the handkerchief, nicely folded, he said later, back to the young man and asked him, "Do you have a motorcycle or a hot rod?" "A motorcycle," the man said. And so Lawson, this tall, gentle, distinguished-looking guy with black-rimmed glasses, just goes on in this casual manner, asking technical questions about how the bike was customized, until the men are just involved in casual conversation. So there's 3 young people in his workshop right there on the bus with him watching this. And so one of them, Bernard Lafayette, realizes that not only had Lawson refused to engage the man on the level of retaliation, but he'd forced his enemy to see him as a human being. Again, you're going to see a lot of that in the Black Lives Matter movement. For Lafayette, the performance by Lawson was a revelation. The black theology student no longer felt the need to explain to people why he believed in nonviolent direct action. It was hardly the nonviolence of begging white folk to accept us, which is how a lot of people framed nonviolence as a criticism. So Lafayette had been raised by devout parents. His dad was also a minister. And the parents had given him 2 pieces of advice that were really hard to deal with when yoked together. One was always stand up for your rights. The other was avoid trouble with whites. So the problem with nonviolence is not only did it appear weak and unmanly when he first thought about it, but it also provokes whites. And so what Lawson demonstrates for Lafayette, as well as later hundreds and then thousands of other young people, was as simple as it was transformative. There was no reason to shout out that he was doing something as an act of courage, not an act of fear. Lawson's gift to Lafayette provided something of an illustration about how you overcome that contradiction his parents had put in front of him. And it was an offering he supplies to many other young activists from the South between 59 and 65. So one thing before we get back to the Freedom Rides of 61. Between 59 and 61, he's not advocating immediate action. He says to these young people in this annex of this red brick church, you have to figure out how to control your fear. And to do that, you've got to develop compassion for your opponent. And they're like, what? Right, what? Compassion for the people that are spitting in our faces. And so here is a really startling component of nonviolent direct action, which you can also see in Black Lives Matter. Compassion is practical. If they treated others with civility and dignity, they increased the chances that they would be treated the same way. Of course, there are those crazy people who don't give up, who aren't going to hand you their handkerchief, are going to keep beating you. And they're like, he would say to them, yeah, you might die. And then I'll rise at your funeral and say, damn, he was nonviolent, right? But that was his message, that most people, when treated with dignity and respect, will respond in kind. But the kind of determination and courage to act first in that manner is not commonly found, and it really has to be something people take time to consider and train themselves to do. And so that patient behind-the-scenes work for long months and even years bore fruit in May 1961 when Nash and Lewis say we're getting back onto the bus. We're going to get back on the bus in Anniston, Alabama, and we're going to try to make it to New Orleans. So they do. Again, there's more fire bombings, more beatings. All of the riders are arrested. This is a particularly difficult scene. John Lewis and Jim Zwerg. Jim Zwerg suffered, you see him up right here, but he had permanent brain damage after this incident. As one SNCC veteran later remarked, it was only the Nashville student movement who had the fire to match that of the burning bus. And adults and other students who had been on the ride initially simply fell off. And I think that's because they didn't have that long-term work with Lawson behind them. So what happens is that they ride all the way from Birmingham, Alabama to Jackson. They don't get to New Orleans. And they're the first of what would be the tidal wave of over 400 clergy, students, housewives, and other ordinary Americans arrested for breach of peace. So these first 21 make it to Jackson. They're arrested in Jackson, sentenced to breach of peace, and they end up for 90 days in, here's them riding. They forced federal government to protect them. They wind up here in Mississippi's infamous Parchman Prison. Now, it's not exactly what Mississippi had hoped for, because 3 months in Parchman, where you have absolutely no amenities and challenges of all kinds, meant that the only thing they had to do was to talk to one another and to learn about one another and to share strategies and to share techniques. So by the end of that 3 months, they feel like a family. People have described it the same way they describe military units bonding, and they decide that they're not going back home the same way that they went in. They're going to go all throughout the South. And those that want to go back north are going to start support groups to support the work going on in the South. And this diagram, I don't know what can you guys see that in the back? It shows here a little bit of the areas that had a majority black population. And so they went into those territories in the South thinking if we can get those black Americans registered to vote, they're going to have majority status in their counties. They're going to be able to elect their own sheriffs, their own school superintendents, their own school boards, their own county commissioners, right? And so that was where they focused. These young people, after the blistering experience in Parchman, went throughout the Black Belt, especially in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia, and tried to get people registered to vote. These are counties where, of 1,002 African-American adults who are eligible to vote, there's 3 people who've been able to register, right? That's the level of disenfranchisement that's happening in that time. And so they're released from Parchman in the fall of '61. They stay in the Black Belt for not a month or a year, but almost all of them stay for 3 and sometimes 5 years, working alongside people until the Voting Rights Act is passed at the end of the summer of '65. And they force federal marshals to take their places. That's what the Voting Rights Act of '65 does, is it forces federal marshals to come down and protect people's right to register and then vote. And it would be hard to exaggerate this youthful achievement. I don't want to take anything away from Selma the movie or of Dr. King, but I would say that it was a whole bunch of people that contributed to the passage of the Voting Rights Act and that these young people were key. So what exactly were they able to do, though largely forgotten and invisible to us today? In the early 1960s, they inspired hundreds and then thousands of ordinary citizens to get the greatest attempt at democracy since the American Revolution to come to fruition. Police beat them, shot them, put guns to their head, and in some cases pulled the trigger, yet far more stayed than died. They became prophets of a new civic religion. And so after turning its back on the Mississippians who registered in the Black Belt in the summer of '64, the National Democratic Party, to sort of make up for its betrayal, promised future changes that would expand the participation of women and minorities. So they reject the movement in '64 and they say, but by '68 we promise that every delegation that comes to the National Democratic Party convention is going to reflect the demographics, both gender and race, of that state. So if you're in Mississippi and it's 40% black and 60% white, then your delegation to the National Convention has to be 40% black and 60% white. These were called the McGovern Rules, and they explicitly outlawed racist local party affiliates, and they massively increased the number of women and minorities in party leadership roles. And so I would argue that people like Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton would not have been possible without this 1964 challenge that generated that kind of pressure for these new rules. It would really be hard to overstate as well that what they did was they made it impossible for local law enforcement to stop every sit-in and every wait-in and every movie drive-in sit-in, right? So they made local law enforcement work so hard that they couldn't keep up with enforcing Jim Crow, so they stopped trying. And then, of course, they put the manpower behind the achievement of the 1964 and 65 Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts. So I just wanted to touch there on their use of militant nonviolence and their voter registration work, both of which brought the nation closer to that promise of political and social equality. But today, we see a really different kind of militant nonviolence. So people are calling for an end to police brutality, access to the vote, and those two things are just sort of one of a wide range of more humane democratic conditions that people who are part of Black Lives Matter are focused on. At the center of this is a yearning for a more genuinely free and just society. It looks a lot like SNCC did in 1960. But that pull is again becoming overwhelming. I think you can see hints of this earlier. It particularly shows up among all ages in the 2008 election, where you see not just people going into a voting booth and pulling a lever, but people registering voters, organizing rallies, taking people to the polls, organizing online information sharing, using social media, putting pressure on the government to address their needs by turning out in larger and larger numbers for the election than ever before. I'm just going to give you a little brief show of students taking the lead between that 1960s, early 60s moment. I'm just going to hit a couple highlights. You see, I don't know how many of you, the iconic tank man here, the single student standing up against unjust and brutal central authority. This is in Baltimore, when the city was refusing to pay for adequate schooling. Students went during rush hour and lay in on streets. South African movements for racial justice in the post-apartheid era. We saw this in the Green Movement in Iran in 2009. And that takes us just, I'm going to again hit just the highlights of Black Lives Matter. So some things that really stick out for people who are involved in this vary widely. So people in Ohio might be more impacted by the deaths of people like Tamir Rice and John Crawford. But I'm going to hit sort of what has been some of the major flashpoints of Black Lives Matter, and that is Trayvon Martin, the young 17-year-old who was walking home at dusk on February 26 in 2012, and a neighborhood watch leader shoots him and then is found not guilty a year later. This is the young man who many people have seen video of, John Crawford III, who is a 22-year-old father of two, was in Walmart, and this was all caught on the tape inside of Walmart. He was shopping for a weapon, and he picked up a weapon, he put it down. A 911 call was made that later was shown to be greatly erroneous. Police came in, and within 2 minutes, he was dead. There was no indictment. Michael Brown in August of 2014, no indictment. Michael Brown is particularly important because his body lay on the ground for 4.5 hours before it was tended to. And as all of us can imagine, the disrespect and lack of humanity involved in that singular fact has mobilized many, many, many young people, including many of our young people in the Durham and Duke arena. And then the Eric Garner killing, which happened earlier than Michael Brown, but because the incident was widely assumed that there was going to be an indictment because the tape was so clear, the verdict that there would be no indictment unfolded. It was announced on December 3rd. And the hashtag politics of I can't breathe, many of you might have seen in terms of athletes and others protesting that particular killing. On our campus, one thing that I wanted to mention, and I'll show some images of it in a second, are that medical students around the country on December 10th, which is International Human Rights Day, took part in a really interesting mobilization called White Coats for Black Lives. It gives you just a little bit of a sense of timeline. I'm going to skip some of these slides, but let me just say that it's interesting to note how current activists are mobilizing using and kind of combing through Dr. King's commentary, lectures, writings for inspiration and insight. So here's one example. This is a young person who's involved in the Black Lives Matter movement, and she's quoting, "We must be concerned not merely about who murdered them," and here Dr. King is talking about the 4 little girls in Birmingham, "but about the system, the way of life, the philosophy which produced the murderers." So he's clearly talking about Birmingham, but this young woman is asking us to look at the role that law enforcement plays today in society, right? Asking those same set of questions, not to look at the individual names, right, of the people who committed these murders, but how do we think about the system, the way of life, the philosophy that underlies it? This photo by a photojournalist named Karan Otto has become iconic. Can I just see a show of hands? How many of you have seen this? I can't get a sense of how widely. Okay. So this is in October of 2014 in Ferguson. And this is a little boy, he's 3, his name is Nigel, and he's run away from his grandmother, right? I mean, he's just doing what little kids do. And she's yelling after him to wait. And so he stops, and this man gets this. It's just an iPhone picture, but it went viral on Twitter. Many saw the resemblance between this and the 1989 Tank Man picture in Tiananmen Square, this uncanny resemblance of these lone individuals facing a larger state bearing down on the most basic individual right, that to life free from being killed by the state, has really moved people and mobilized them. Here we see how others have drawn for inspiration on what the great historian Vincent Harding calls the river of struggle for a more perfect union. Harding says, just as rivers have the ability to smooth the roughest rock, so does the power of will and fight to be free. So the intensity of the nation's 200-year oppression and repression of black bodies has ironically forced innovation, creativity, and ingenuity, the way of making a way out of no way, so that African Americans are overrepresented, and I would argue widely overrepresented among the most creative of the nation's liberatory minds. And so here we have just a young group of students who are trying to call on this history and to make connections between 1814 there on the far right, 1914, people who are forced into convict labor, and 2014, looking at the role of incarceration in Black lives and forced labor. So the Black Lives Matter movement is no exception to that overrepresentation of African Americans as among the most ingenious, creative, liberatory minds. I'm just going to show you a few things that are happening. So this is a tweet that went out. I know the font is too small, but it lists just for last weekend on MLK, the weekend to celebrate Dr. King, what's going to happen in Oakland, right? So they've got 9 a.m., 11 a.m., 7 p.m. on Saturday. Sunday, 11 a.m., 12 a.m., right? They're just moving through the day. These are things where they're trying to get in the way of everyday business as usual, to be impolite, and to get people to reflect on what role any of us might be playing in that larger systemic group, right? Are we a part of the problem? They're forcing us to ask that question. So has anybody heard of Black Brunch? Nobody? Okay, so this is going into restaurants that are serving brunch on Sundays and asking people for 4.5 minutes to listen to what's happening and to what they're requesting, which is for people in the brunch restaurant to stand with people in solidarity to protect young people, and particularly young Black and brown bodies. And so some of the restaurant eaters are like, what? Like, I'm having brunch. What is this, right? And other people say they're mad, right? And they're pushing back. And other people then stand up and say, I have no idea that this was happening, but I stand in solidarity with you and I want to be helpful to the movement. So those are the kinds of activities. They're geared not like SNCC to be arrested, because part of the problem is mass incarceration, but they're trying to find creative ways to interrupt business as usual. So you might have seen this. This is the Mall of America on the busiest shopping day of the year, was shut down by a die-in by folks from Black Lives Matter. And now the mall itself is suing activists for lost revenue. A New England Patriots game was happening. This is a commuter train. There's only 5 young people, right? But they're standing across the tracks asking people to consider the role that violence plays in young black lives. This, by the way, I don't know if you can see this at the bottom. There's a guy who's on that, really ticked off place, and he says, "Nut jobs stop a commuter train on the way to Patriots playoff game." And the reason why I picked this particular tweet to share with you is that's exactly how SNCC was referred to. They were called routinely nut jobs, crazies. They were, at times when they were arrested, subjected to psych evaluation. So you can just see some of the responses here. Why'd the train stop? Maybe they slow down and apply a little brush back. Morons, one and all, looks like a real movement. The third rail is 18 inches to their right. And so this sums up, and I think I'm going to have to stop it here and do my sum up. This sums up what people who are part of that movement are saying. So Alexis says, "Welcome to the life of inconvenience, America. You are cordially invited, whether you want to be or not." So the last voice I'll leave you with is that of Nona Perry, a 20-year-old in Oakland, who's trying to organize other young people to take full advantage of the opportunities that they have. She's working with young people who are largely disenfranchised. And she says, "It's really hard to get people to think about what their potential is." And I said, "Why is it hard?" And she said, "It would be okay if I was working with 4-year-olds because they don't have a sense yet of what's not possible for them. But by the time they're 14, they've been so many times told they don't matter and shut up and sit down and be quiet and do your work that they no longer feel that sense of the possible. Young people already start believing," she says, "the institutionalized messages about themselves. It's hard to pull them out. So what we do is we find the system that we want to target, we learn about it, we train other youth and train them how it works. You have to get off your feet. You can't sit in a classroom or in the back of the office. You have to move. We use theater of the oppressed, and people act out the experiences they've had." And then so she described how at BART stations, the public transportation stations, they had young people dressed up as slaves who were wandering around BART, and when the people were like, "What are you guys doing? Why are you dressed like that?" they would then engage them in a conversation, right? It allows people to act out the experiences, she said, and show the community, this is what we're going through. Here is one solution, and what do you think are other solutions we could use? So they're trying to give back to the community by training other youths. She says, "They're killing our people every day. It's very hard not to come to it with self-defense. You see police beating on other people of color, your people. You want to approach them the same way with violence. It's like the cops don't get it. You're a human being too, just like us. You can shoot us. We can shoot you back. You can die, and I can die too. I don't know what's going on in their headspace," she said, "but it's really hurting. That's why we protest." So I'm so sorry to have gotten slammed like that. Here are Duke medical students on December 10th. "As medical students, we realize that we are by default advocates for the health of the community," said second-year medical student Samara Jenks, one of the organizers at the medical school's die-in. "Officers are sworn to protect and serve, and when we put on a white coat, we're sworn to serve and protect as well. As much as it's an issue of police brutality, of social justice, it's an issue of public health as well." Law students then did the same thing in the Duke Law School. "This might not lead to legislation," one young man said, "but it might cause people to think introspectively about how they think about these issues and maybe treat people differently." So after the Eric Garner non-indictment was announced, young people in the graduate and undergraduate populations staged vigils and die-ins on campus's Central Quad. They marched around East Campus. They invited all kinds of people to this, so it was a remarkable diversity of student participation. And they said, "Not only blacks but gays, immigrants, and others, we all need to face this issue, come together to tackle it. Anyone with whom this resonates, we invite you to become a part of the conversation, to stand up for what you think is right, to make sure this does not happen again, that all of our lives are safe." That all of our lives are safe. That really affected me. And so one thing I would ask you to think about here as we close is that young people are again leading the way, pushing all of us to work towards a society where injustice is infrequent and where, quote, all of our lives are safe. As a sign of the hunger in our culture for greater democracy and equality before the law, I'd like to close by asking you to think back to your own goal. Given that the average American lifespan is about 77, and people here in the room might correct me if I'm off by a year or two, many of you will have years to work toward that goal. And that's what SNCC asked. They said, oh, it's probably going to take us 15 or 20 years to break down Jim Crow. And I'm here today in part to share the unknown history they made that once started, it took them 5 years to break down official Jim Crow. It's a powerful lesson. Thank you. Do you have time for questions?
Yeah, I was going to
Okay.
say, I think we do. It is, it's right at 1:05. For those of you who are going to leave, you do what you need to do, but I think we're going to go ahead and take questions. That's fine, absolutely. And then once we're done, we'll be out in the atrium for refreshments, for a book signing. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you to Dr. Hogan. Thank you to Jessica and friends. Thank you to Gina for putting this and organizing this together, and for Anthony and Martin to get our YouTube streaming. And I'll turn it back over to you, Dr. Hogan.
Yeah,
Thank you,
great.
by the way, very much.
Thanks.
Just really well done.
Thanks. So before we look at some of the possible things that people are thinking are important goals, I'd love to just get some questions on the table to see where people are. Comments, questions, thoughts?
I have a question. So my note there had to do with having a 4-year-old biracial nephew. African-American mom, white dad, my brother. I love this kid like he's my own kid. I don't want this kid to get shot. He lives in Washington, D.C. He's a good kid. He's only 4. And so how do I take this energy, being Auntie Shauna, wanting to protect not just him, but other kids too?
So that's a really important question, and I think a lot of older people have been asking, how can we do that? People who are not Black have been asking that. So there's a lot of different responses. So I'll share some of them with you, and some might resonate and some might not. But I would say that there are multiple places where people can support this kind of work. And one is just taking a strictly legal approach. So there's been some really powerful legal interventions put forward. One is, of course, around police training and police selection and police ongoing, how police are evaluated. One is on making sure that grand juries, and as soon as there's a police officer involved in any significant crime, not just killing, that is turned over to a totally separate entity, not to the district attorney's office in any given city or county, because the district attorney's office and the police officers work so closely together that oftentimes that's a reason why there's no indictment on police killings. So one really important piece of legislation is that. How do we make sure that every single police incident that's significant is given over to a special prosecutor rather than the Attorney General? But then there's some important impolite kinds of actions that people are taking in solidarity. So hosting conversations. The nursing school here just did a really incredible, it was basically a teach-in that a PhD student did with her entire faculty, and everyone from the nursing school was invited to look at white privilege within the nursing profession and to start talking about race within that setting. So how does that impact health? What kind of healthcare impacts does that have? What kind of decisions get made based on that in terms of who's going to be a nursing professor? I mean, it was a very provocative, so kind of in your own workspace or your own church life or religious life or in your own neighborhood, are there things that speak to you, that conversations that you want to generate? And I would think that the third thing is just contributing to people that are doing legal defense for those involved in Black Lives Matter, or people that are, like the Ferguson Public Library did a fantastic fund campaign. It was shut down in the wake of the protests, and so a lot of people put energy into raising money for that so that they could find positive programs to support in the Ferguson community. Other people in the room might have, does anybody else know of things going on more locally that you'd like to make sure people are aware of that are solidarity with young people? Actions that we can take? Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Comments?
Lots to think about.
Yeah.
So how has your personal research impacted your home life?
The question for people in the back is, how has my personal research impacted my home life? And I would say that when I was a young person, it impacted my home life by lots of very aggressive conversations at the holiday dinner table, where my uncles in particular thought that I was a race traitor. And this was in the 90s, and so they didn't feel politically correct. And so, but since then, it's, you know, my spouse and my children are completely, I mean, I kind of found family within the work that I did, so it's right in the stream of it. And so now it's, if anything, I'm bolstered by my family and my community. The SNCC people have become very important to me in terms of mentors and people that I see myself as accountable to, and wanting to share what I've been able to learn from them and document from them with young people is really important to the sort of how I think about my professional work, and that's very personally meaningful. Thanks for the question. Yeah.
So my question is, how do we assure that Martin Luther King Jr.'s message that nonviolence is really a global issue, and that his nonviolent anti-war position was very much responsible for his being killed? How do we keep that in the forefront? That part of the problem is obviously racial, and part of the problem is that you become heroic by killing people.
So I think we need a lot more Lawsons. The guy with the glasses that taught people how to act nonviolently over a sustained amount of time despite a lot of challenges. But I think what you're talking about is a much richer conversation that we don't have as a nation about. He talked about the horrible triplets of oppression, right? Dr. King did. Militarism, economic materialism, and racism. And I think that is really interesting for us to consider, raising that conversation. How far have we come? Have we not come very far, right? To sort of begin to talk about that. That scares people a lot. And what you're saying is that, you know, militarism and violence and assassination, boy, did they have an impact, right? But I would argue that many of the people who do nonviolent work are trying to figure out what is that key, right? What's going to be the today's equivalent of the sit-in? And many people have tried, but the sit-ins were tried for 80 years before they took fire. So I don't think any of us have the magic solution, but it's really an important conversation to jumpstart in all our communities. Other questions? Okay, so I'm just going to share with you, I really enjoy doing this part because it gives people a sense of the possible. Again, SNCC people set out thinking Jim Crow would take 20 years at a minimum. And then, you know, within 5 years, they had these two major pieces of legislation which made Jim Crow illegal. So I think it's really important to think of our constrained sense of possibility. If someone had told us that in 1960, within 5 years, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Act would have been passed, most of us would have gone, whatever, idealist. Like, no way, right? Because it's safe for us and it feels better to be cynical a lot of the time because then we don't get our hopes busted. But I just want to give you a sense of what could be possible in 50 years if we had a vision that some people have shared today. So I'm just going to read a few of them. Equality in banking. Girls and women, empowerment in education and opportunities. I'm going to skip that one, I'm so sorry, because of handwriting issues. Equal pay and opportunities for social and economic advancement. Reducing the gap between the richest and the poorest. Peace. universal health care, equality in job placement for all, respect for all, no matter their position in society, an altruistic government that works together to accomplish goals that create an environment of equality while respecting and valuing each other's differences. First impression, view me as a human being, not a color, not a gender. Honest political leaders and government, or equality among our leaders without race being a factor. Lack of class distinctions based on economics. That all people are colorblind, religious blind, and ethnic blind. My hope is the work can really let us live as one. I would like not to be fearful that my biracial nephew who lives in an urban large city could be pulled over by cops and shot. A less militaristic world. Less wealth inequality globally. Every person should have a right to live without being harassed and killed. The 99% control more than 50% of the country's wealth. A peaceful earth. Total equality for every race despite of their skin color. Everybody could get a good quality education. Funding available to all for access to quality food and education. That all sides of contentious issues and problems can embrace truth and facts, not just sound bites. Reduction in poverty and disbanding the social economic class disparity. Economic equality. More diversity acceptance. And the last one we have here. Many changes are needed and are making sure the juvenile system works. So it just gives you a sense of the range of possibility and hope that is in the room. And my hope is that we can take that and rather than see it as a 50-year span, right, knowing that people share that together, some of those hopes are really similar, that we can find ways to work for that sooner, right, rather than later, and very much in the spirit of Dr. King. So thanks for coming out today. I'm going to leave these with Gina in case she wants to do something that kind of gives you a sense of where people